coming up on this episode of The Roundtable.
The supposedly objective public servants are actually more partisan hacks than they were 2 generations ago. Without some cleansing of the departments of the administrative state, uh, competent government that allows planes to take off and land safely will suffer. And part of making bureaucracy more accountable is transferring functions to the states, but the states might have the same problem, and they're going to have to do some of the same stuff. Cleansing bureaucracies every generation or two is really necessary to make to keep them competent. And uh, and so, when the administrative state, when the civil service was established, there was always a worry that it would be like an aristocratic faction within this otherwise Republican people. And, that has happened. It is now an unaccountable, somewhat aristocratic class within our country. And for the first time, someone is intentionally trying to bring accountability to that class.
Well, welcome everyone once again to this now the final installment of the Cincinnatus Series, a special podcast and vidcast series here at the Claremont Institute under the auspices of our normal channel for the American Minds podcast. But we wanted to continue this series or conclude this series with some discussions about how legislators in red states or maybe even purple states can think through some of the major issues. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. And I'm joined once again by Scott Yenor, our senior director of state coalitions. Also, his day job is at Boise State University. I'm also joined by Jim Blue, a co-founder of the Defense of Freedom Institute and a former assistant secretary for planning, evaluation, and policy development at the Department of Education. And Jeff Anderson, an old friend of Claremont, a frequent Claremont Review Books contributor, a former director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and these days president and founder of the American Main Street Initiative. I thought, gentlemen, we might start in a very general way and just get your thoughts on how should red state legislators or even just sensible legislators of any political stripe think about the possible opportunities presented at the state level by this Trump administration, which has been disruptive. We were talking offline a little bit about Doge. It has been sort of breakneck speed for these opening months, but as they settle into their agenda, how ought red state legislators or legislators in general think about what they should be up to, or what advantages or what opportunities they should take advantage of?
Yeah, let me just open up here. I mean, I would say that the attitude that I would take as a red state legislator is that we're moving toward a more radical understanding of federalism. That is the attempt to end federal regs and perhaps even the oversight of some departments is are indicators that it's time for states to assert their sovereignty over the areas that they have discretion, and even to expand those areas that they have discretion. So I don't think people should be settled into the old way, the old federalism, which was really nationally directed, and the states are becoming more and more administrative units of the national government. That they should find avenues, every avenue for experimentation and to get themselves out from underneath the federal apparatus. The Trump administration, it appears to me, is acting as a kind of shield or a an umbrella under which states can begin to kind of more boldly think about their areas of discretion. That's a very broad statement, but that's an attitude that I think hasn't been as alive as it was, except maybe in the early 80s during my lifetime. Nixon talked a lot about a new federalism, but I think we have real opportunities for new federalism in various areas of policy.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, let me build on that with
Mhm.
a very specific example, and that is the Department of Education, education in general. For 40 plus years, the federal role in education has grown, become much more expensive, and much more intrusive. And I think any state legislator will attest to this, that it's harder and harder to do things at the state level because of all the federal rules. And it's very clear that President Trump, as well as both sides of the Congress, believe that we have to shift power away from the federal government and back to states and families and local communities. And so, what we're watching are some states stepping forward saying, this is a great opportunity. We need to help this along. We need to insist on doing block grants. We need to insist on doing school choice programs or education freedom programs. And so, the more states do that, the easier it will be for the Trump administration to succeed in its overall goals here.
Yeah, I think just broadly speaking, the Trump administration is providing a lot of cover for the states right now. The aggressiveness, um, the take no prisoners sort of mentality of at the federal level. I think it should hopefully stiffen the spines or the knees of some of the milquetoast state legislators who don't really want to do much of anything. It's an opportunity to really be much more aggressive. To maybe maybe look at that Ron DeSantis playbook down in Florida and take a number of pages out of that across the board.
Yeah, let's drill down on education policy a little bit, Jim. You talked about block grants and school choice. Um, are there some aspects of the reassertion of state control over and influence on education policy that maybe aren't as obvious that state legislators ought to think about and educate themselves about?
Yeah, there will be some things coming down the pike, which they've already revealed their cards. We know they're coming as they begin to scale back the Department of Ed. Um, the I'll start with an example of Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, passed in 1965, first to give more funding to economically disadvantaged children. But over time, that program has grown and has come with more and more restrictions around how you actually spend that money. As people in DC deciding they know better than the local states and local communities do about how to spend that money. As a result, a lot of it is getting soaked up in the administrative sponge, right? Where the federal department needs a little take because they have to have staff to do all the rulemaking and monitoring. They give it to a state education agency, and that agency takes a little bit of money for itself. And then it goes down to a local school district, or what we call local education agencies in the law, and they have to take a little bit. And so very little money is actually getting to the students and teachers that we're asking to do better with this. Um, so you can cut through all of that by asking for the money to come as a block. The secretary has to give you a waiver in order to avoid some of those rules and regulations, but she'll never do that unless you ask her to. And so encouraging state chiefs to just request that the money come. And ESEA is more than Title I, it's several titles that come as a formula grant. And so it can be really streamlined and you can use the money better at the state and local level.
Yeah, that sounds like a refreshing change from the practice that we've come to expect in the post-Great Society era. So,
Yep.
yeah, you don't get what you don't ask for. It's a good lesson for state legislators, among other things.
And what we're hoping
I think
is
there's
that
so much.
Congress will eventually see this and say, why are we requiring this of everybody? Why don't we just let all the states, all the local communities decide what to do with their money?
Yeah, I think there's so much that can be done in education. Clearly, for starters, getting it back to not only the state, but really the local level. I think we saw during the whole experiment with COVID just how broken our educational system is, but that only begins to get at it. I mean, one of the sort of like, I don't know, one of the aspects of COVID that was sort of interesting is all the time that the kids were out of schools, which was generally very damaging, would have been a whole lot more damaging if they actually learned a lot more when they were there on a normal basis. Um, I think that there's a move now, of course, mostly driven on the right, but somewhat on the left, for more homeschooling as parents have gotten fed up with the public schools. And I think there's a whole lot more that could be done on that level. Like I live in Virginia, where Virginia does very little to help homeschooling parents. That it's about 2/3 of the states have a Tim Tebow rule, for example, where homeschool kids can play sports or do extracurriculars at the public schools. Virginia does not have that. And while Governor Youngkin has supported it, I don't know that he's been very vocal. And the very slight control the Democratic legislature has kept that sort of thing from passing. I mean, at least in Virginia, they kind of stay out of homeschoolers' business, which is worth something. But there's just education across. I think looking at the textbooks, looking at uh, John Fonte, who works a lot with me at the American Main Street Initiative. John talks about how the textbooks now are teaching this three worlds view of America, where we don't come from England, we come from Europe, Africa, and Native Americans, and just that sort of thing that's everywhere. There's so much that could be done there with improving the schools.
Yeah, that's that narrative. Just to people may have been curious to hear that for the first time. So that's the idea that the founding stock of the nation came from Africa, the local native Indians, and then Europe, of course.
Europe at large.
Yeah, got it. Says nothing,
Yeah.
of course, about our post 1965 immigration waves, but yeah. What I mean, tariffs are on everyone's minds. We've now a couple days into a stock market adjustment of what duration will be for us to find out, given Trump's aggressive moves on tariffs. What sort of things should states expect or react to or do in response to tariffs' effects on what I guess housing costs, energy, infrastructure? How should they think about that or continue to adapt to it?
Well, I want to defer to Jeff on this, but I want to say one thing first.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's in the same spirit. I think I would try to look at this as an opportunity. So the goods on which tariffs are placed are growth industries in America, and states should consider them growth industries. So President Trump talked about this in his special address to Congress when he talked about attracting certain businesses to Pennsylvania or Ohio, and building new plants because the countries where those plants were located don't want to have to pay the tariffs. So I think we have a kind of competitive federalism situation coming up as a result of the tariffs, where you're going to have 50 states, or maybe not all 50, but many states are going to be competing for the businesses that are going to be planting themselves in America. And I think that uh, you know it's going to take a while for businesses to come online, and the tariffs are going to have to last for long enough so that those businesses can get their feet under them. But states, I think, should be aggressive in trying to recruit the industries that are going to be protected by the tariffs. It's the old approach, and states should get involved in it. And whatever that means, certain property tax breaks, perhaps for some businesses. But I would just make sure I'm getting value out of it. That is, that the businesses that are coming are going to be worth having, that they're going to have sustained high paying jobs, and create a lot of spillover effects for the community. But I think of it as an opportunity for states to compete with one another.
Yeah, Jeff, are there better and worse ways to go about that sort of thing? I ask it knowing that I think the answer is yes. But what should, I mean, states I think should focus on broad-based and across the board and open to all incentive structures rather than what we've seen in various places throughout American history, but especially over the last 50 years, occasional kind of crony capitalists picking winners and losers with individual companies. And what's the best approach?
No, I certainly agree with that, Ryan. I mean, I think in general, the states that have created a pro free enterprise, pro business sort of climate are going to benefit from this a lot more than the ones that haven't. We've already seen such examples of this with, I mean, businesses may start to behave kind of like everyday citizens have in the last few years, as we saw just this incredible migration from I would argue, from the COVID, the states that were just had particularly tyrannical COVID policies, from those states to the states like Florida and Texas and South Carolina and Idaho that had much more reasonable policies. We've seen such a shift in that vein where Florida picked up more people in net uh, migration in the United States than live in Miami and Orlando combined. I mean, that's even when you take out the ones who left Florida. So you may see something similar with businesses. I don't see a lot of businesses thinking, "Oh, let's go to California or Illinois or New York." I think the states I listed are going to be a lot more attractive to them, and so that may work out naturally quite well.
Scott, do you want to talk a little bit maybe about the broader? You've been working in Florida for the last couple of years on education policy, but not just education policy. What are some opportunities for states to, I would say, beef up their economic and political sovereignty to really use this opportunity to sink some deeper pro-state federalism roots, so that, God forbid, if there's some snap back to the left at the national level, they could be a little hardened against federal abuses.
Yeah, I mean, the education field is one field that Florida's really led the way, and their principle has basically been um, patriotic standards, competence standards for public schools, and promotion of education freedom abroad. So they've made it easier for charter schools to be established. They've passed universal education savings accounts for people to be able to take their money and kids to private schools. They've deregulated, partly as a result of COVID, but also as a matter of principle, the process of certifying teachers, so that it's got a very the number of teachers in Florida who have traditional certification is much lower than almost every other state. I think save one state. Um, they've created in the higher ed sphere. They've both reformed their institutions by creating new general education requirements, by getting rid of departments that are infused with identity politics, or at least dishonoring them and taking them more out of the curriculum in the state universities and colleges. Um, I think they'll be at the forefront of accreditation reform when it comes to higher education, making the state into an accreditor, perhaps, or some such thing. Helping to stand up new accreditors, so that when uh, and heaven forfend, there is a snapback, the education system is more independent of the national government than it has been at any time in our lifetime, really. And both for standards and for its money, because the more the state emphasizes education freedom and education savings accounts in charter schools, the more independent they are from the federal umbilical cord of money. So I think that's been one really crucial achievement of the DeSantis administration in Florida, a kind of top-down effort to make the state in charge of education. And there's a lot more to say about all of that, and I have them in one of my reports at the DC Center website, which we could probably link in the show notes, even though I'm not supposed to say that, I think. Right? And so I think that's one, as I say, big place that the DeSantis administration has helped. But it's also, built a very pro-business environment. It's attracting both tech and manufacturing to the state. It doesn't have an income tax. It has a nice sales tax. When they've run surpluses, they've had sales tax holidays, and they've taken some items off the rolls in sales tax. It doesn't have crazy property taxes. I mean, I'm sure Jeffrey knows these statistics better than I do, but I think Florida's budget with the same number of people as New York is half the budget of New York. So its tax burden is half the tax burden of New York. So it's going to continue to have that very business friendly environment so that the industries that are protected by the tariffs are naturally going to be attracted to a place with an excellent education system where they have high quality workers, a service oriented college system, and a great business environment. And that's why I think Florida is a great model for the rest of the red states. They have acted like a lot depends on what they do, and that it's necessary for them to take over their government institutions while keeping, a good line on taxes and spending. And it's been a very admirable accomplishment for them, I think.
So, Scott, let me build on that because in the education reform world, Florida is the exemplar. It has a very robust school choice system. It's got standards. Some of what they're doing on accreditation is really worth following. And so, we've watched other states more recently, the Arkansas, the Iowas, start replicating what uh, Florida has done, starting way back in 1998 when Jeb Bush got the first reforms passed. There's a lot that will be happening to encourage this, not only in red states, but in purple and blue states as well from the federal government. Let me just take a minute to explain the way that Florida was financing its early school choice program was through tax credits. As you know, there's no income tax in Florida, but there were other taxes that they could use. I believe that this budget reconciliation will end up having a tax credit for donations to scholarship granting organizations. So, regardless of where you are in this country, if you want children in your community to have choice, you'll be able to get a one-for-one credit by taking your tax liability and pointing it at one of these SGOs. The number they're talking about is $10 billion. It's a lot of money. Is probably at least 1 million, maybe 2 million students that would then be given school choice, not just to go to private schools, but to also to homeschool, to get homeschool curriculums, to get the kind of special needs therapies that people want. And so we think that once that bill passes, and it should happen this year, we're going to see an explosion of education freedom, school choice across the country, not just in red states. And so if you're a state legislator and you want to get ahead of this, you should be thinking about establishing your own program that the federal money can come on top of. Right now, none of these state programs get federal money for their scholarships. Or you might want to sort of encourage the establishment of SGOs to scholarship granting organizations in order to serve students of particular interest to you, and whether that's students with disabilities, military connected families, or whatever. So there's a lot of activity that can happen. And, we've been pushing for this since Betsy came up with the idea, whatever, 8 years ago. But I think we're on the cusp of getting it done, and people can really explode education freedom in their states if they embrace this.
Jeff, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe the major buckets of a Main Street economic policy that ought to be front and center at state legislators' minds. I think of the overlap between traditional areas of state sovereignty and policy making, and also maybe some of the lower hanging fruit that they ought to take advantage of, whether it be in energy or housing or education or anything else.
Yeah, I think it's just it's not that different than the federal level in certain respects. I think in the states that are pro business, pro energy, they're going to provide a lot better environments for businesses, for jobs, for their citizens. I think I think a lot of what Scott and Jim have talked about. Again, Florida has led the way on all of these things. The difference in regulatory burdens that from state to state, of course, is just phenomenal. My brother owns a business in Los Angeles, which is sort of the about the worst place probably to try to actually own a business and have any control over it. And you go all the way from there to like one of the reddest counties in Florida, and the difference is just phenomenal. So I think it's certainly an opportunity for states and localities to try to cut the red tape and move away from all of the just oppressive do this, do that for no sensible reason, all these rules put in place by people who have never remotely run a business or even come close to doing so. Um, I think that sort of thing is crucially important.
Are there some structural reforms if you're a state legislator maybe wanted to be a little more ambitious that they, I mean, other than taking Florida as a model, which we've established is a good way of operating? I know that we have a patchwork of 50 different regulatory environments, which you just mentioned. But what are sort of the main areas, or even sort of state constitutional reforms that states ought to think about or emulate from other states?
Well, I guess I'll take that first.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on the state to some extent and the localities. You may have places where you have a state that, and again, I can't help but think back to the example of Florida, that how when the localities were doing things that DeSantis absolutely did not think they should be doing, like imposing mask mandates or vaccine mandates, this kind of thing, to move it more into that realm rather than economics for a second. DeSantis took a lot of actions to limit local control. And I think in some of these states, especially where you have certain localities that are just ridiculously left-leaning, it might be a good idea to strip some of the local control on some of these matters and say we're not going to allow this or that. In general, I think you mostly want to do the opposite of having there not be a bunch of state burdens. Leave it up to, better to have a few localities put on some burdens rather than an entire state. So I think it depends a little bit on the circumstances and what you're trying to deal with.
Yeah, one of the things I'd say on this is that we have two models for like regulatory reform going on right now. One of them at the federal level is the Doge idea, which many states are adopting, and I think they're adopting it without actually knowing what it is. It seems like the lowest hanging fruit in Doge is to find very politically controversial regulations, programs that fund the left exclusively or predominantly, and cutting them or at least freezing them so that they can be overseen by the legislature or the executive in a more responsible way. And I think that's great. And I'm sure that it's true that states, even red states, are funding the left in ways that they don't even know because they're funding their health and welfare departments or their departments of ed, and the money is going, indirectly into like Planned Parenthood or gay pride parades. I mean, we've seen this in Idaho, so I'm assuming it's happening everywhere. And so I think a Doge-like activity is a really good idea. And then there's just the kind of old Reagan era cost benefit analysis on regulations. Who knows how much housing prices are shaped by the various ways zoning laws work in cities, and how those zoning laws are supported by state laws. And so having a kind of office of regulation management or something like that is a good idea, because you might be able to cut lots of costs because you're cutting regulations that are no longer deemed necessary. And I think you'd even get a lot more bipartisan buy-in for such things, which isn't to say you shouldn't do the Doge thing, but I think that regulatory reform at state levels is necessary, and in fact, it's almost more fruitful at the state levels. If Madison is right about how constitutions work and factions work, the smaller the sphere, the more likely you are to have special interests controlling the policymaking agenda. And then states, I think they're more vulnerable to this in some ways than national government at least was before the Great Society. So I think regulatory reform is a big deal. The Trump administration has partly shown the way, but I think if you combine the Reagan and the Trump approaches to this, you might really get somewhere in the states in as far as reducing the costs to citizens on their goods and on their lives.
Yeah. Doge may 50 Doges bloom, right?
Well, it's already happened in several states. I think I know Florida has done it with its university system. Oklahoma has passed something, and a couple other states too. So yeah, I think there won't be 50 though, Ryan. That's the
No, I know. Yeah. What about, I mean, Jeff, I know you've thought about this a little bit, but you know, a big problem, it's not a problem in a lot of medium or smaller sized states, but I mean, a huge part of family cost is housing. I mean, does anyone know about any of the plans that HUD has or the Trump administration has for HUD? And do we see a similar analogy with the unwinding or block granting of educational funding that might be fruitful in terms of housing, beyond just the obvious housing problem, which Jeff and I are both former natives of California. I mean, a big part of the problem of housing prices in California is not just that it's a beautiful place that a lot of people want to live in and has had a historically large illegal immigration problem over the recent decades, but also the per unit housing costs because of regulations, environmental or otherwise, are just egregious. Yeah, you're in heated agreement, Jeff.
I'm totally in agreement on that. Yeah, I mean, exactly.
I think I am a Californian still, and so
Yeah, Jim, you are too. You're
I'll
stuck there.
comment that the recent fires that caused billions of dollars in damage in Los Angeles, and when we're up against being ready for an Olympics in 2028, will really test the state whether they can actually streamline and get costs back down to, say, Florida's level. Sorry, will be it'll be a real test. But I sense that as crazy as California politics can be, there are a lot of moderates in the city and in the state that are saying this is nuts. We need to streamline things, and we'll see if it happens. I'm hopeful. That's why I'm still here. So
Yeah. Yeah, I
I
mean,
think yeah.
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Scott.
The only thing that I've heard coming out of HUD is the rescinding of that affordable housing plan that Obama era regulation that required kind of diversity in housing and dispersing um, uh, our diverse population around the country. Um, and so I haven't heard anything about how they might be handling their budget. And but I do think that states, regardless of that, really should take on the idea of accelerating permitting and making that stuff more transparent and going after zoning regulations that make things excessively expensive, making sure that the Department of Environmental Quality, whatever it is called in your state, is not, impeding zoning on environmental grounds that are independent of what the EPA is doing. And so I think there's lots of ways in little ways that states and localities can do what they need to do to lower prices. Um, Knowing that if the demand is high, the prices are going to go high. Like I think that's still a fundamental reality here in Boise. And here's one thing. I mean, um, we just recently built a wing of a new school, and one of the things that's really frustrating to me is that 10% of our cost went into sprinklers. Like, can we stop that somehow? I mean, like, we just spent $200,000 on sprinklers that are never going to be used and never work. But all right, that's just my own pet peeve. I'm going to move on to something else. But yes,
Was that due to a federal rule or a state rule, Scott?
I think it's insurance rules which are regulated at the state level, but they might all have the same rule. It's just amazing how much those things are and how they're required everywhere. So.
Yeah. I think it's kind of crazy not to encourage building at this point at the state level, given the high interest rates, which again can be traced sort of indirectly to COVID and the COVID policies, all the blowout spending. And the high interest rates are such a double whammy of makes it hard to buy a home, and it makes it where very few people want to sell their homes because they don't want to move into a place with much higher interest rate. And so there are far fewer homes on the market. So more than usual now, certainly there's a strong, I mean, there's a demand for homes. And so just allowing people to build is hugely important. And Scott, you're talking about the affordable housing. I mean, that is just the typical crazy backwards idea of the left, where instead of actually doing anything whatsoever to make housing affordable across the board, and in fact putting every impediment imaginable in the way of that, they say let's have expensive housing everywhere, and then we'll force some affordable housing right there with it, which is kind of like the housing equivalent of school busing or something. I mean, nobody wants this, except for the few people who kind of hit the jackpot on it. So, I mean, I think at the very least, red states should refuse to adopt that sort of language, and or be clear that affordable housing means actually lowering the cost of housing, and not mandating that you shove some small units in with larger ones.
Yep.
I wanted to get you guys' take on this emerging. I don't know if it has any direct application to state legislators other than their rhetorical efforts at town hall meetings or just addressing some of the concerns of their electorates, be they left, right, or center. And that is, there's this emerging narrative that Trump is somehow unprecedentedly monarchical, that he's accumulating all power in the executive branch, and is really, in his attack on the administrative state, attacking expertise as such, and really is determined to burn down the way we do modern government completely. And in the meantime, losing good controls of, or good expert evaluation of and process. What do they call this now in the literature? It's like a process-based bureaucracy, which safeguards people from rampaging executives and make sure your water is clean, your air is breathable, and your planes don't fall out of the sky. That's sort of the attack from the left. So it would be nice if we could equip people to turn that attack back and really address those concerns, which are valid if it were actually true that the goal of the current, as the left dubs it, sort of nihilistic, burn it all down Trump administration, is to make everything more dangerous and more costly. How should we be talking about this semi-revolution going on at the federal level?
Well, again, forgive me for bringing this back to education, but I think very clearly in education we're seeing the opposite, where he's literally trying to move power out of Washington D.C. and back to local families and communities. There is this odd, what would we call it? There's an irony in all of this. He is also trying to shrink the administrative state, which is the executive branch's source of power. And I think what's happened is that because the left has captured so many of the independent agencies and all of the departments, that when he's trying to shrink their power, the left interprets that pretty much the opposite of the way I would, is increasing his own. And so there's an irony of, I don't know what else to call it, that they've been able to define terms in a way that what he's doing to the administrative state is interpreted as increasing his own power. And it actually comes up again within the Department of Ed, because you'll see a lot of stories from the left where it doesn't make sense to them. He's shrinking the department, and yet he has this very aggressive agenda that he wants to pursue around school choice and other things. And to them, they need the agency in order to do those things. And so it doesn't make sense. But for people who are trying to explain this, I think they're just literally misinterpreting what he's doing. He's in this area. I don't know foreign policy or very well, but in this area, he seems to be actually relinquishing power.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, the traditional critique of bureaucracy is that it's unaccountable. And our bureaucracy has been unaccountable for generations. And generational lack of accountability leads to corruption. And so the supposedly objective public servants are actually more partisan hacks than they were 2 generations ago. Without some cleansing of the departments of the administrative state, uh, competent government that allows planes to take off and land safely will suffer. And part of making bureaucracy more accountable is transferring functions to the states, but the states might have the same problem, and they're going to have to do some of the same stuff. Cleansing bureaucracies every generation or two is really necessary to make to keep them competent. And so, when the administrative state, when the civil service was established, there was always a worry that it would be like an aristocratic faction within this otherwise Republican people. And, that has happened. It is now an unaccountable, somewhat aristocratic claque within our country. And for the first time, someone is intentionally trying to bring accountability to that claque. And I think that President Trump should be completely lauded for this. It's necessary, and it's salutary for the bureaucracy itself um, to hold it to account with political authority.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Ryan, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead, Jeff.
Um, you, Jim and Scott, you both make good points. I mean, it's I think people are confused about like you say, Jim. There's a huge difference between the giant, unaccountable, largely unaccountable administrative state and the actions of the president. But both that's part of the executive branch. So if the complaint is that the country is moving too much toward monarchy, well, I mean, I would share in that complaint over if you're looking at it from like a decades long perspective. But I mean, let's look at what preceded Trump. We had Biden thought he could unilaterally take $400 billion in student loan debt and shift it onto taxpayers and mandate that even private businesses across the country have mask and vaccine mandates. Um, Even what he did with the pardoning power on his way out the door, he more or less eliminated the death penalty at the federal level. I mean, these are monarchical sorts of actions. And if it comes down to, I mean, so I'm all for the notion we need to get Congress back in the game and actually have Congress do its job and be the representatives of the people that they're supposed to be. But if it comes down to a choice between process-based bureaucracy and a president who himself or him and his team of political appointees knows what they're doing and actually competently run the government, I think the vast majority of Americans are going to prefer the latter scenario.
We can take this one level deeper. There were a lot of actions in the first 45 days where they were proudly moving fast, breaking things. We'll fix them later. I really appreciate where the president seems to have pivoted to say that we actually need to look at things more carefully. What has happened, like the easy things, it's real easy to fire probationary employees, for example. But those might have been the young blood, new thinking that we needed, right? And so turning to the cabinet chiefs like Linda McMahon to say, take a look at your department, figure out where you would use a scalpel rather than a meat axe to make cuts is going to be a lot healthier and I think a lot more enduring because a lot of the early actions, while they certainly woke up the bureaucracy, I think a lot of them may be reversed by the courts. So.
Well, I think that's surely true of some of the probationary employees. The flip side, I think, is that most of them were probably picked by the Biden team. And so I think that's part of why they're probably rightfully distrusted in many cases. Well, what I think is
exactly, but we don't want to throw a blanket over the entire crew. We just need to have some more thoughtfulness and intentionality around it.
Well, right. I mean, part of the challenge is, I think, part of the challenge for the Trump administration right now is that I don't think there's a lot of political appointees in place in a lot of these departments at anything other than the top couple levels. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but like when I was at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I certainly could have very quickly told the Attorney General, this is these are our rock stars. These are the people that are okay. These are the people that are deadwood. But I don't know that the people are in there right now who can provide that kind of um, solid appraisal. So that's, I think, one of the real challenges that the Trump administration, I'm sure is facing right now. And another one I think that they've got to keep in mind is that what tends to happen is that Republican administrations will reduce the size of the federal workforce and without changing the statutory limits on how many people can be in a place. And then as soon as Democratic administration comes in, they just hire all the way back up. And then that's a huge part, an underappreciated part of why the federal government is why career employees are so left leaning, is because Republicans often cede the hiring power to Democrats. So I think you've either got to change the statutory limits, which is, of course, not easy to get that through the Senate, or for the end of the term, start rehiring a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about for state legislators how to do this, talking about federalism, they need to be thinking about the same problems with their own state. We would like to have so much in education funds the state education bureaucracy. And for them to take control of it instead of letting the 10% set aside rule how many people are going to hire, they can set those limits and be more prescriptive about what they do. So many of them end up simply filling out federal forms, right? I've heard estimates from state chiefs that up to 2/3 of their staffing is dedicated to fulfilling federal rules and requirements, not actually doing anything for the benefit of students.
Yeah, I mean, we should remember the 80-20 principle, which is not a law of nature, but it's a decent guide to things that 20% of the people at any given place are doing 80% of the work. I mean, the fanciful notion that this agglomeration of bureaucrats at the federal and state level that have gotten there in recent decades in our post-New Deal environment where every problem seems to need 5 bureaucrats to solve it. The idea that all these people are essential is absurd. And so at the state and federal level, I mean, I was talking to a friend of the Institute who's newly over at the Department of Education, and you can correct him if he's wrong, Jim, but he said, as far as he could tell, 80% of the careers are just warming seats. Now, Ed and HUD and some of these newer agencies might be worse than others, but it is in many ways a federal jobs program for mediocre people. While they also, all of them contain dedicated expert public servants who just want to do their jobs well, there are a lot of people, far more than I think normal Americans would appreciate, who really aren't doing much, but are collecting 6-figure salaries.
Right. And as
Well,
Jeff mentioned, they're not, I'm glad to hear you have somebody there. They're not staffing up very quickly
Yeah.
and have the expertise. But there are people like Jeff and me who are out there. We've been there before that they can talk to. And in fact, are. Jeff, I'm sure they're talking to you as well. So,
While we have it,
I think
yeah,
all of this can be done at the state level too, so that the biggest department usually in the state government is health and welfare or something like that. Um, Being intentional about who you have in charge of that. Someone who may not be the most experienced person, but is aligned, is competent, and is ambitious, and wants to bend this agency in the direction of red state policy, which might mean breaking up hospitals. It might mean having alternative ways of uh, you know helping alternatives to monopolistic hospitals arise in your area. And there's lots of things that can be done with ambitious, aligned administrators. And so instead of just finding the person who's the head of the hospital here, find someone who wants to be a disruptor in the industry, and they can change these bureaucracies. That's happened. I mean that we had such a similar thing happen here in Idaho in the last couple of years, and I think it was more than just luck that it happened. And so there's lots of appointees. I mean, another thing that Governor DeSantis has been great at is being very intentional as appointees and finding people who are aligned and kind of know what time it is. and recognize that now's the time to assert as much state sovereignty as we can and disrupt monopolistic, corrupt, lazy institutions. And so I think it's an executive attitude like that.
That's well said, Scott. I wanted to say that makes me think of something else I wanted to raise as far as something I would love to see red state legislatures do is, excuse me, is to look at these emergency powers that they've granted over the years to health departments, to governors, and really review those because we just lived through an experiment that showed that I mean, at the state level, the separation of powers just sort of disappeared during COVID. You had these governors acting like kings, and it wasn't pretty. I mean, you had 60% of Republican governors imposed mask mandates, and 100% of Democratic governors. So, yeah, that is an easy thing to, with all of that very fresh in mind, to tackle. I think, and emergency powers should be really limited, really scaled back, and it should probably be something where the legislature can take them back, in a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, using this opportunity and the fairly recent pain and suffering and absurdity of COVID to make the case that state legislators ought to put themselves in a better position to exercise more oversight should another pandemic come along. I think that's a great point, Jeff. I mean, the California example is great. You know, Newsom was using powers that originated they'd been modified since a bit, but the spirit of them dated back to World War II, from the 41 and as early as that. So the idea that America in 2020 should still empower governors in that way and over something that maybe looked like a war but really wasn't a war should cause people some concern and get legislators thinking about how to claw a lot of that back.
We certainly spent like we were in a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to, that's right. We need a, it's maybe not the most urgent thing at the moment, but a full Doge investigation of, I know a few are running, but of all, I mean, how much, I wouldn't be surprised if nearly half of the COVID money that went out the door was somehow fraudulent or corrupt, especially at the state level, as it just, everyone was awash in newly printed money. Jeff, I wanted to, while we have you here as a former director of BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, what's the current state of crime in America? I know we had a kind of spike in 2020 and then some hangover effects in the years since, but what should state legislators understand about that, just as a general matter?
I think the biggest story about crime in the last, say, 5-6 years has been that there's been a huge spike in urban crime, and no corresponding spike in suburbia and rural areas. You really saw pretty close to very minimal changes in crime from 2019 before COVID, through COVID, after COVID. Very little change in rural areas and suburban areas, but in urban areas, you saw from 2019 to 2023, I believe is the most recent numbers we have now at the federal level, a 40% increase in violent crime in our cities, in urban areas. A 40% increase is just absolutely massive. And it's even worse if you limit it to the more serious violent crimes. So that's the real story that the press has not been telling anyone all the way through and beyond COVID. And it's, I think, pretty clearly tied to who's in control in these urban areas. You've got a lot of extreme leftist, you have DAs, you have police chiefs, mayors, what have you, that are of the school of thought that it doesn't really make sense to have police, or they're at the very least something a police force should be kept as small as possible. They don't want to prosecute anything. It's really the opposite of the broken windows policing that worked so wonderfully in New York City, and we've seen the opposite results, both in just terms of the incredible disorder that almost everyone is seeing going into cities and seeing the tent cities and the drug addicts and the utter opposite of a family-friendly place, all the way to the huge spike in violent crime. And that really, so far, we haven't seen that abate in the cities. I mean, I do think the murder rate peaked probably back around 2021 and has come down some. But although in a lot of these cities, it certainly hasn't come down to anywhere near where it was prior to COVID. So anyway, that's the story: is crime in the cities, and it's sort of been invited, and it came where it was invited.
Yeah, and it has all sorts of spillover effects into the ability of businesses to thrive, and all sorts of other factors that affect quality of life and really revenue. So it should be a central focus of state legislators, because of course they're the regimes that they set up at law enforcement level all the way down are really the front lines of this fight.
Jeffrey, is the rate in blue states different, like markedly, than the rates that you'd see in red states on these matters? So that
Yeah, I mean, the national stats don't really break that out, Scott. But I mean, the vast majority of urban areas are controlled by the left at this point. So it's kind of it's an interesting natural experiment. And all the numbers I'm citing are from the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, a survey that's been in place since the Nixon administration, largest crime survey in America. And it actually asks crime victims whether they were the victims of crime. So there's no opportunity for police departments to manipulate these numbers. The Americans are saying there's a 40% increase in crime in urban areas, violent crime. And property crime is way up too.
Yeah.
the reason I asked was that, if there's, as you look at the top cities for crime, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, those are blue cities and blue states. So there's nothing that a red state government could do to corral in a loosey-goosey, locality like those cities.
Well,
But
there are some. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I think what you're getting to, St. Louis is one of the worst. Missouri is pretty red at this point. New Orleans is one of the worst, and Louisiana certainly is mostly red.
yeah,
I mean, I'm sure there's others that are near the top of the list. So it's not. There are certainly opportunities for at the state level to try to, if you've got a city that is sort of inviting this kind of lawlessness, to try to take some action.
then what would those be? That's kind of curious. What could, like, a Missouri legislator or a Louisiana legislator do to limit, I don't know, the autonomy of New Orleans and St. Louis in this case? Or is it all about personnel? Is, like, they have
Yeah,
to get
I
rid
mean,
of
it
the
really is.
DA? Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is the voters, right? That they've actually chosen these folks, but I'm sure there's ways to put some pressure on them. I, I'm not exactly sure what that would be. I thought you had the idea there, Scott. I was.
Oh, no. No, I only had the insight of, could there be something that could be done? But that's not my wheelhouse.
Well, I mean, the power of the purse at the state level, I should think, would be a big lever or tool. Just even departments that might have a disproportionate number of constituents who seem to want disorder, whatever that may look like. Incentivize them to get more funding when they start bringing crime rates down. I mean, sort of. I know we're sitting here from our armchairs talking about state criminal justice policy, so take it with grains of salt.
Yeah.
Nothing
High
like
funding to shoplifting levels.
Yeah, right, and recriminalize shoplifting. Yeah,
Yeah,
at a certain level.
yeah. Some of that stuff's really, really crazy because like you were saying, Ryan. I mean, it not only is it the violent crime that makes it hard to have businesses thrive and a livable city, but it's the stuff that really nowhere near a big violent crime, but it just makes things. How can you have a business when people can just walk in and take stuff out? And so you see these shops closing down, and I mean, all this stuff is just like it's 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 experiments playing out in real time of horrendously bad policy ideas, many of which are sort of like ideas repackaged from the 60s or 70s, but with even more craziness added in. So I do think you're seeing the trend shift some on this, and I think crime was a notable issue in the most recent presidential election. But nevertheless, things are clearly not back to where they were pre-COVID on crime in a lot of cities.
Yeah, I was in DC last week and was at a CVS in between Adams Morgan and DuPont Circle, and it seemed like 40, maybe even 60% of the store was locked up behind plastic because it's all very stealable and likely to end up down the street on someone's card table on the black market once it's stolen. It's really remarkable. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time, so I guess we can stop there. But I do want to thank you, Scott and Jim and Jeff. Encourage everyone to go check out Jim Blue's work, along with the work of his teammates at the Defense of Freedom Institute, and look at all of Jeff's work at the American Mainstream Initiative, and check out all of Scott's stuff. Sorry, what?
I think you said mainstream, Main Street.
No, I said street. Maybe I mumbled. Sorry.
I apologize.
It's also a fishing lobbying organization now. The Main Street. Yeah, Main Street Initiative. Thanks, Jeff. And as always, you can see all of Scott's work and the work of our DC Center at dc.claremont.org. If you want to learn more about the Institute, go to www.claremont.org. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate and check out our publications, americanmind.org and ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Scott. And thank you all for watching.